On a July morning in 1755, the largest army Britain has ever sent to America is marching through a river valley in Pennsylvania. Drums, colors, sunlight on some 1,400 bayonets. When the trees on both sides begin to fire. 3 hours later, 2/3 of that army is dead or wounded. The general who led it has been shot off his horse. Every officer who rode beside him is down, except one. He is 23 years old, and he is not even British. He is colonial, a volunteer, serving without rank and without pay. He has been so sick for 2 weeks that he can barely sit a horse, so he has tied cushions to the saddle. Before the day is over, 2 horses will be killed underneath him. And when he takes off his coat that night, he will find 4 bullet holes in the cloth and not a scratch on the man inside it. The Empire barely knew his name that day. You know it. And this was not just a battle he survived. It was a war he had helped start. By accident, at 22, with 15 minutes of musket fire in a rainy ravine. A war that had already cost him a signed confession he couldn't read, and the only surrender of his life. George Washington's legend does not begin with the country he built or the war he won. It begins with the war he lost, and everything losing taught him. This is how a legend starts. Start with what he wasn't. He wasn't rich. He wasn't educated. He wasn't, by the rules of his world, going to be anyone. Virginia, the 1740s. George Washington is the first son of a second marriage, which in Planter, Virginia means the leftovers. His older half-brothers were sent to school in England. George got a country tutor, and then, at 11, a dead father, and with him the end of the schooling. What he inherited instead fit in one hand, a surveyor's chain. So the fatherless teenager measured other men's land. At 16, running survey lines through the Shenandoah wilderness. At 17, a county surveyor sleeping under strangers' rafters. He left the continent exactly once in his life, at 19, to Barbados with his older half-brother Lawrence. The man who had half-raised him, now coughing blood, hoping the island air would cure him. It didn't, and George caught smallpox there, which scarred his face and very nearly killed him. It didn't do that either. Lawrence died the next summer, 20 years old, and the last person who had ever opened a door for George Washington was gone. From now on, he would be forcing doors himself, and what a young man with no name and no schooling needed most was a stage. In the fall of 1753, the governor of Virginia had one that nobody wanted. France was building a chain of forts down the wilderness rivers toward the Ohio country, land both empires claimed. Somebody had to carry Britain's warning to the French commandant, leave. A 900-mile round trip in winter through mountains, flooded rivers, and contested ground. The kind of errand you give a man you can afford to lose. The 21-year-old volunteered the day he heard about it. He made it there. The commandant at the last French fort, a one-eyed veteran with perfect manners, fed the young Virginian at his own table, complimented him, and handed back an answer that meant, stripped of its politeness, "We are not going anywhere." It was the trip home that tried to kill him twice. First, near a spot his own journal calls Murdering Town, an Indian guide walking with the party stopped, turned, and fired at Washington from 15 steps away. And missed. Then the Allegheny River, running with ice. Halfway across on a homemade raft, the current slammed the ice into it and threw him into 10 feet of freezing water. He hauled himself out onto an island and spent the night there in his frozen clothes. And by morning, the river had frozen hard enough to walk home on. Shot at and missed, drowned and didn't. He was starting a collection. And the whole way, the forts, the councils, the assassin, the ice, he had been keeping a journal. When he got back, the governor liked the journal so much he had it printed. Then London printed it. At 21, in the coffee houses of a capital he would never see, strangers were reading the adventures of Major Washington of Virginia. He expected the reward to be a real commission, a king's officer at last. What he got was applause, a colonial promotion the empire didn't take seriously, and orders back over the mountains, this time with soldiers. He was about to become famous on both sides of the ocean, just not the way he wanted. Spring 1754. Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, 22 years old, leads about 150 men over the mountains toward the forks of the Ohio, and learns on the road that the French have already taken the spot and are building the strongest fort in the country on it. His orders cover this situation the way orders always do, badly. What he has, instead of instructions, is an ally, the half-king, a Seneca leader who brokers between the empires because playing them against each other is how his nation survives, comes into camp with news. A French party is hiding in a ravine nearby, lurking, watching. Whether they were scouts or messengers is the question the world was about to start arguing over. What happened next took 15 minutes. At dawn on May 28th, Washington's men and the half-king's warriors surrounded the ravine. Someone fired. No one would ever agree who. When it stopped, a dozen Frenchmen were dead and 21 were prisoners. And among the dead was the party's commander, a 35-year-old ensign named Jumonville, killed with a diplomatic summons in his baggage. How he died in that ravine is a question we're saving for the end of this story. France's version was simple. Their party was an embassy carrying a message, exactly the errand Washington himself had run the winter before, and Britain's colonial had ambushed it. They did not call it a battle, they called it the assassination. A British writer later put the verdict in one line. The volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world on fire, because this skirmish in the leaves became the spark of a war between France and Britain fought in America, in Europe, in India, and on every ocean. The first war in history you could honestly call a world war. Nobody standing in the ravine knew that. The 22-year-old wrote to his younger brother that the bullets had whistled past him, and his words, "Believe me, there was something charming in the sound." That letter got printed too. The French, he knew, would answer, so he fell back to a wide, marshy meadow and built something, a circle of upright logs about the size of a house in a bowl of soggy ground, with wooded high ground within musket shot on three sides. His own officers looked at it with something close to despair. Washington, 22 and certain, wrote the governor that he had cleared a charming field for an encounter. He named it Fort Necessity. That word choice, at least, no one ever argued with. Now watch what the war he started sends him. On July 3rd, through grey sheets of rain, some 700 French and Indian fighters come out of the trees, and the officer leading them is Jumonville's older brother. The battle is a slow drowning. The high ground lets the French shoot down into the fort. The rain floods the trenches until his men are fighting in cold water to the waist. The muskets soak through and, one by one, simply stop working. By dark, roughly 100 of his 400 men are dead or wounded, and some of the survivors have broken open the rum. Then out of the rain, the French call a parley. Near midnight, by candlelight, in the drumming rain, Washington's translator, a Dutchman, the only man he has who speaks French, reads the surrender terms aloud from rain-smeared paper. They are strangely generous. March out with your drums and your colors. Keep your weapons. Go home. One phrase, read aloud as the death of Ensign Jumonville slides past in the dark. On the wet page, it is written, "L'assassina." The 22-year-old signs a confession to assassination in a language he cannot read and will not learn what he signed until the newspapers of two empires tell him. In the grey morning, his survivors march out of the flooded fort with drums beating past the army of the man whose brother they killed. It is the 4th of July. One more thing stayed behind in the mud, his baggage, and in it, his campaign journal. 2 years later, it surfaced in Paris, translated, annotated, and published by the Royal Press of France as evidence for the courts of Europe. The confessed assassin's own diary. The young man's words kept ending up in print, just never on his side of the argument. Virginia's answer to the disaster was to break up its regiment so that no colonial officer could rank above captain. Washington's answer, rather than be demoted, he resigned. If the empire wanted him, it could ask. It asked. In 1755, Britain's real answer to the Ohio country arrived from the sea. General Braddock, 2 regiments of regulars, siege guns, an army sent to do properly what the colonials had botched. Braddock had contempt for provincial soldiers and no power to give one real rank. But he had heard of the young man who knew the ground, and he offered him a place at his side. As a volunteer, no rank, no pay. Washington took it. The man this war had been happening to walked back into the middle of it on purpose, unpaid, to learn how a real army worked. What he got instead was the lesson that made him. The march was an army dragging its own road over the mountains foot by foot. Washington nearly missed the end of it. Dysentery hit him so hard he was left behind with the rear for 2 weeks, holding on to a promise that the army would not reach the fort without him. He caught up the night before, still barely able to sit a horse. The morning of July 9th, 1755, begins as the proudest sight of his life. The army crosses the Monongahela River in parade order, drums, fifes, colors, the bayonets in the sun, 7 miles from the French fort. He would remember it all his life as the most beautiful thing he had ever seen an army do. Then, the head of the column walks into a French and Indian force among the trees, and the forest begins to fire. There is no line to form against. There is no enemy to see. Only smoke and muzzle flash from the ravines on both flanks, and soldiers trained for the open fields of Europe, packing themselves into a red mass on the road, firing blind, hitting each other. Braddock has horses shot from under him, then takes a ball through the chest. The marksmen in the trees pick the officers deliberately, one by one, out of their saddles. Of about 86, more than 70 go down. Every mounted man around the general is hit, except the sick volunteer with no rank. Washington rides through the collapse for 3 hours, carrying orders no one is left to obey. 1 horse is killed underneath him, then a second. The men near him keep seeing his coat jump as musket balls pass through the cloth. When it is over, 2/3 of the army is dead or wounded, and the rest are running east in the dark. And the 23-year-old, who can barely stand, rides all night back through the wounded to bring up help that barely exists. Days later, the retreating army buries General Braddock in the middle of the road it had cut, and rolls the wagons over the grave so that no one will ever find him. The service is read by the young Virginian who had argued with him at table all March long about how wars in this country are fought, and history allows itself one terrible touch of staging. The ground they bury him in is at the Great Meadows, within sight of the ruin of Fort Necessity. The war Washington started had taken 1 year, almost to the day, to march back and bury the empire's general beside the field where its author surrendered. He wrote his family that he had been protected beyond all human probability. 4 bullets through the coat, 2 horses gone, not a scratch. His mother got the gentler version. Something had changed in the way people said his name. A preacher in Virginia that same summer told a congregation of new recruits about that heroic youth, Colonel Washington, whom I cannot but hope Providence has hitherto preserved in so signal a manner for some important service to his country. People had begun out loud to talk about him as if he could not be killed, and as if that meant something. The Empire remained unmoved. He commanded Virginia's frontier defense for 3 more years. He asked more than once for a king's commission, once riding hundreds of miles north just to make the case in person. And the answer never changed. No colonial, however useful, would outrank the Empire's paper. So at 26 he resigned, went home, married, and told his friends his soldiering was over. As far as George Washington knew, this story was finished. Count what the finished story had given him. He knew how the unbeatable British Army moved, how it thought, and how it died in American country. He knew how to hold a beaten army together in the dark, in retreat, the exact skill that later wins the famous war, where he loses battle after battle and outlasts an empire anyway. And the Empire had taught him, free of charge, every time it priced him below men. He had carried out of a burning valley exactly how little a colonial was worth to it. 17 quiet years later, a Virginia planter in his 40s put the old blue coat back on. Every story you have ever seen about him starts there. Now you know what it costs to make the man in the coat. The only war George Washington ever lost ended on a 4th of July. It took him 22 years to the day to take that date back. One honest footnote before we go, because that is how we do things here. The famous prophecy. The old chief who supposedly declared that this man could not die in battle enters the record 15 years after the fact, secondhand, around a campfire. The 4 bullet holes, though, are in Washington's own letter, and that is stranger than the legend. Did he really start the war? 2 empires had spent a decade stacking the powder. His 15 minutes lit it. Both halves are true, and the fire needed no help. And what exactly happened in the ravine? Who fired first? How Jumonville died? And what the half-king did in the final moment? No 2 men who were there told the same story. We told you the parts they agree on. The record does whisper a harder version. That is what records are for. If you want more true stories of legends before they were legends, ancient and otherwise, subscribe. History keeps the journals. We read them.